Hey, welcome aboard. Oh, it auto mutes you. I'm sorry. There
Hi,
we go.
can you hear me?
Yeah, coming through just fine. How's the day
Okay.
treating you, man?
Uh, it's fine.
As my
Ready?
grandpa always said, any day above ground is a good day.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Well, there you go.
Yeah.
Um, is this? I should have checked, but I've been kind of crazy lately. Do you do video and audio?
Not usually. Like video is for anybody that wants to pay for the podcast and VIP kind of experience, but it's not put on YouTube or live
Okay. I
streamed or
mean, I don't
anything.
care. I just wondered.
Yeah, mainly it's audio primary podcast, and then anybody that wants the behind the scenes full uncut conversation, that's what it's there for.
Okay.
Yeah. And well, thanks for saying yes and scheduling so quickly. I bought your book basically the minute that you said yes. I was like, awesome, I'm getting the book, and got 2-day delivery, not nearly fast enough. So I'll get it after the conversation.
Oh, I'm
Uh,
so sorry about that. I
really?
just generally like to move move full speed ahead on everything, and
Exactly. The sooner it happens, the less opportunity for things to go sideways, for sure.
exactly.
Yeah. So I've traveled, been on tour for about 15 years, and I've learned first flight out gives you the most time to adjust, leave a day earlier than you think. Yeah. So moving quick is good.
Yep.
You mentioned that you are promoting the book, your podcast, and the website. Is there anything else that I could softball your way?
Yeah. Here's what's particularly important. I don't know. Do you post this immediately? We were talking about moving fast, but
I usually post them every other week, and this coming Monday is the next day, and I could easily bump you up the line for sure.
okay. Well, here's the thing. I have been recording my audiobook, and it doesn't have a release date, unfortunately, but it's all but done, and they're just
Cool.
about to put it up. I expect it'll get released like 22nd, maybe of September.
Outstanding.
But
All right.
without announcing the launch date, just look for it in the next few weeks would be good.
Makes sense. Makes sense. And if that doesn't come up naturally, I'll shoehorn that in for sure. Got
Okay.
it. So I kind of like to just dive right in, have you introduce yourself so that it's done to your liking, and we'll take it from there.
Introduce myself, including like who I am and what I do.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. I'll make it short and sweet.
Nice.
Okay. Ready? Hi, I'm Art Bell. I spent 30 plus years in the television business. And one of the things I did was I started Comedy Central, which was actually Comedy Channel at the time, while working at HBO. And I wrote a book about it. It's a memoir. And it's all about my experience trying to get a cable channel all about comedy launched in the early 90s.
I am so excited to talk to you on a personal and professional level. I mean, Comedy Central helped me get through college and help my grades go lower because I would stay up late.
I
So
feel good about that.
yeah, you've impacted one life, right? One life at least. So building something that big is not a small achievement. And the subtitle to your book is How You Lost Your Sense of Humor along those lines. So is that pointing to it sounds like a dream, but then when you were actually doing it, it was one of those living nightmare curses that you got exactly what you asked for kind of a thing? Like if that's spoiling the end, we can put that off. But that was the main thing that I was wondering about.
Yeah, it's a good question. And the full title of the book is Constant Comedy: How I Started Comedy Central and Lost My Sense of Humor. And you're in the right direction in that I just wanted to, in the subtitle, allude to the fact that it was incredibly difficult to get this thing started. I mean, the 30th anniversary of Comedy Central was this past April. And I'm very proud of that. The fact that I was part of building something and started the whole thing, and that's still around and 30 years later. And it's it's kind of a cultural icon. I think I can say without fear of contradiction. And but most people probably now look at Comedy Central and say, yeah, it's probably a success from the beginning. And I just wanted to talk about the fact that it was not a success at the beginning. It was, I guess you would call it a failure at the beginning. I mean, it was really my first year on the job. I thought I was going to get fired and they were going to close us down every day when I came to work. That's how badly things were going. And by the subtitle, I wanted people to understand that these things are hard and that it takes a tremendous amount of effort and a tremendous amount of overcoming seemingly unsolvable problems in order to get these things going.
Yeah, I'm often impressed by people who think you can achieve big things without sacrificing anything. And it's kind of like the E equals MC squared of the universe. In order to get or build, you have to sacrifice an equivalent value. I had the dream of being a touring performer and toured all over the world, and it cost me everything, career, relationships, opportunities, because I said yes to that instead of everything else. And it really is a big thing. How did that year of constant terror affect your personal life? Because there is no separating something that big from a big personal part of your life.
Well, I think the answer will surprise you a little bit. First, I'd like to note that it wasn't terror. I mean, terror is, we know what terror is. Terror is fear for your existence. I never really thought anyone was going to kill me if I didn't pull this off. The first year was full of my feeling particularly responsible for the channel and its success, and really the livelihoods, I guess you can call it, for the hundreds of people who were working on the channel at that time. I mean, these were people who gave up other jobs or for whatever reason found themselves at the channel, and they wanted it to succeed, not only because they had a personal stake in it the way I did, because I started it, but because they needed the job, So I felt particularly responsible. Mm-hmm. Now, back to your original question, the reason I think the answer is going to surprise you is because in October of the first year, I got married. And I remember my boss, when I told him that I had to take a couple of weeks off for my honeymoon, saying, oh, wait a second. First of all, when did you find time to find someone to get married to? And, it was true. We seemed like, and we probably were working close to, every day, all the time, on weekends and everything else. But around the time I started this whole thing, which was a year earlier, basically, from when we launched, I met the person who was going to become my wife, Carrie Livingston. And so I was pretty deeply into the relationship when this whole thing started sliding down the chute, into, oh my gosh, I'm not gonna have time for anything. I do tell an interesting and kind of amusing, if you like this kind of amusement, story about being taking a weekend and a couple of days to meet my future in-laws in Colorado. I flew from New York to Colorado, and I was there with Carrie, and I was there for like a day. And I get a call from my boss's boss, actually the president of the channel. And he says, Art, you have to get back here. The chairman of HBO wants us to be in a meeting on Monday morning, and you have to be there. I said, hey, Dick, no way I can get there. I'm meeting my future in-laws. I just got here. I can't just like up and leave, He said, well, you have to be here. And the timing was such that basically I was going to have to leave immediately. And I said, look, no way I'll get a flight. He said, don't worry, I got you a flight. I got your tickets. There'll be a car picking you up shortly. It was the total nightmare scenario. And I went back for the meeting, and I flew back that night is what happened. And it was a crucial meeting. I did have to be there. But that's how it impacted my life. I mean, it was very intrusive. But that, as you say, is something you give up. That's what you give up.
Yeah. And for large organizations and any kind of company, one of my mentors was at Sharp Electronics. He was an executive there that helped it go from $1 million company to multi-billion-dollar company. And he explained a business is like a dragon or a monster. It lives on profits and it's hurt by liabilities. And that's all the company cares about, really. Before you launched the whole project and that year before that you're working on it, take me before that year. Were you used to working at high executive levels and dealing with hot shots and big shots? How is it that you pitched the idea and made it attractive enough for somebody to go, yeah, let's do this?
An interesting story. The short answer is mostly no. I was not used to, certainly in the entertainment business, working with bigwigs and hotshots. I will say that before I got into television, I was an economist in Washington, D.C. for a few years, right out of college. And I did find myself in some pretty high-level meetings, once with the president of a very large liquor company. And I remember him referring to me as the kid throughout the meeting. What does the kid think? But that was a different situation because I was a consultant, an economic consultant. And what I was respected for was my intelligence and my ability, my analytical abilities, and everything else. You get to television and your analytical abilities, in something like this aren't really as important. It's really about, certainly on the programming side, it's about being able to come up with ideas, or at least identify good ideas, make things happen, produce, all those kinds of things. I was very much a marketing and financial analyst at HBO. That was my way in the door. And that's what I was doing. I was nowhere near programming. I was nowhere near the kind of thing I had to be. The people I needed to talk to in order to make this happen. So I would, I wasn't keeping it a secret. I would talk to lots of people, anybody who'd listen at HBO, saying, hey, we really should do a comedy channel. It's hard to do. You can't do that kind of thing. So one day I said, I'm going to go pitch, if I can get a meeting, Bridget Potter, who's the head of programming at HBO. Now, she was as high up on the org chart as you can get without being the chairman, right? And I was as low down on the org chart as you get without, cleaning up. So with all due respect to the people who do that. And I had no business really walking in there and pitching her, but I was, pretty sure this was a good idea. So I did go in. It's pretty much the first chapter of my book. I went in and I talked to Bridget. I did get an appointment and I said, Bridget, I really think HBO should do an all comedy, 24/7 comedy channel. And before I got much further, I mean, I 10 seconds later, she said, it can't be done. And let me tell you why. And she went on for, a good 10 or 15 minutes telling me in excruciating detail why it was completely impossible. We wouldn't get any A-list talent. I mean, the managers wouldn't let Robin Williams and Billy Crystal, they're not coming on this channel of yours. It's not going to happen, and it's very expensive. And why would HBO want to risk their reputation? So she went on and on. And at the end of the meeting, she said, look, Arthur, thanks for coming in. She called me Arthur, which nobody does, except my mother. And she said, thanks for coming in, but you really, you don't know much about television and you certainly aren't a programmer. So again, thanks for coming in, but take care. So that was it. I thought the whole thing was, done.
You got the brush off and that's it.
If Bridget wasn't going to say yes, it wasn't going to happen at HBO anyway. But I knew she was wrong. And I did go on to, in the next few weeks, write up my proposal for a comedy channel, thinking I would staple it to my resume and get a job, seriously, and get a job. Listen, I was young and
right. You show up with
cocky.
ideas.
I wasn't actually cocky, but I was, young enough to say, look, I'm not betting my career at this point. I don't have a career, it's early. And so if I go to Viacom and talk to them about it, or Paramount or MGM or CBS, maybe they'd get interested. So that was my plan. That was my plan.
Yeah, that's really cool. So when you did get the project to go live and this machine starts kind of taking off, how did you go from the idea guy, because it could be, oh yeah, great idea, we'll take it from here. How was it that you were at the helm for that?
I have no idea. And let me correct you. I was not at the helm. I was not at the helm. They were, the powers that be were not kind of messy enough to let me run the whole thing. I was young, I wasn't a top executive. So they put that in the hands of somebody else, and they built a structure around it, but they did give me a job. They gave me a job and they made me vice president of programming, which totally knocked me out. I mean, I didn't expect it. I was happy. I was hoping they'd just give me a job at the channel,
Yeah.
And there I was, vice president of programming, actually working on the programming. And listen, like any startup, and because I was the progenitor of the whole thing, I was working on everything: marketing, brand, what are we doing? What kind of stuff are we getting? What's the budget? What's the, it was the whole 9 yards. There's only a handful of us at the beginning anyway. So as I said, that was additionally something that made me feel very responsible for the success of the channel. I mean, to a certain extent, I almost surprised myself when they said, okay, let's take a run at this. And it was Michael Fuchs, the chairman of HBO, who was the one who said that. I got in to see him kind of by accident and pitched the channel. And I didn't have a presentation. It was kind of spontaneous. And I was lucky enough to have a lot of passion about it and have had, thought about it for so long and written it up that I got through a basically ad hoc presentation to the chairman. And he said, let's see what this looks like. I mean, he didn't say, yes, let's launch Tuesday. He said, let's explore, let's do some research. Let's, check out the financial stuff. And he also said, I want you to work with Stu Smiley. Stu Smiley was the head of HBO programming, comedy programming. I'm sorry, HBO. He was the vice president of comedy programming at HBO. Now that was a pretty cool thing to be in those days, because HBO was becoming famous for putting on specials, comedy specials with, Robin Williams, Billy Crystal, those guys. Also uncut, unedited. Those were the only places you could see these guys doing that, except if you went to a club. So they were really getting a reputation in comedy, and Stu was the quarterback for all that. He knew the comedy business, and what I knew about the comedy business was nothing. So the first day I met Stu, he said, what do you know about comedy? And he didn't say it in a nice way, He said it in the kind of way that said, I'm not going to help you out here.
Right. Who do you think you are about comedy?
Exactly. and thereafter, he would always refer to me as, hey, there he is, the guy with the big idea, especially in that first year where things were really floundering around. And Stu, who had been enjoying a fairly nice career as the vice president of comedy, and when he was made vice president of comedy at the Comedy Channel, and basically putting his whole job at risk, he wasn't too happy with me, but he did the job. I mean, listen, of course it was an opportunity for all of us. And you'd think it would be a kind of a dream come true with Stu, but he had a little attitude about it. Like, are we going to get this right? And what happens if we don't?
Right.
So
his stakes seemed a lot higher, huh?
I'm sorry?
His stakes seemed a lot higher. Established career at HBO, recognizable name with pull. And now here's this new offshoot that's kind of a gamble, and now go work there.
That was kind of a running through line for a lot of people at the channel and me and my relationship to them. The head writer, a guy named Eddie Gorodetsky, who is still writing in Hollywood today, very funny guy, very talented, was not happy with me because his vision for the channel and my vision for the channel didn't completely jibe. And he thought I had too much to say about it. And he told me in those uncertain terms several times that he thought I should resign for the good of the channel.
Hmm. That kind
And
of leads into a question I had, which is, as an analyst, number cruncher, analytical versus soft skills and relationship, tact, negotiation, all those things that kind of get short shrift in companies, but make or break a lot of opportunities. How was navigating that change between numbers and people and really big, powerful personalities that know exactly what needs to happen and you should probably resign? How was that transition between those two worlds, or was it kind of more of the same?
well, it was difficult. Again, more because the comedy business was a club, like most businesses. I mean, and I was definitely not in the club. I was neither a comedy writer, nor a comedy performer, nor a comedy television executive when I first started the whole thing. And, that left me pretty much outside and people looking skeptically. Now, I don't want to make this sound like I was, sort of going down to the cafeteria and eating all by myself every day. And, it wasn't like that. I mean, and many people were a pleasure to work with and good to me. I just cited those two because they were kind of like the grouchy ones, and
Right.
always the ones calling me on not knowing anything about comedy. But here's what I knew about comedy. I was a comedy nerd. I mean, I had been watching comedy on television, the stand-up comics on the Ed Sullivan Show, which is probably a show that a lot of your viewers, listeners don't know, but it was a weekly variety show that everybody in America watched every Sunday night at 8 o'clock, that had the best comedians from all over the country and all over the place. I saw Richard Pryor's debut on the Ed Sullivan Show. He was 20 years old or something. I mean, that's one of the places you went to see comedy. And then I just loved comedy. I wrote comedy. I wrote satire. I started an underground newspaper in high school. I was in sketch comedy in college. I wrote a comedy review in business school that we performed and sang in. That was a riot. It reminded me, by the way, how much I love comedy, because I did a good job writing that. So it wasn't like I was, just this, eye shade guy in the corner who said, "Hey, why don't we do a comedy channel?" It was really something I had thought about a lot for years. And I had, if nothing else, a great sense of the history of comedy to that point, who was important, where it came from. And that gave me a little bit of an in with the comedy crowd. As far as the powers that be, listen, as I said, I was an economist in Washington, and we were dealing with the Department of Energy and the EPA and private companies. And I was, 23 years old at the time. And I was always thrown into meetings with very important, powerful people. And, the first couple of times it was probably not so good, but, you learn, uh, you learn how to do these things. You learn how to negotiate. You learn how to present yourself and present your ideas to people who don't know you and don't particularly have any stake in your success, in order to be successful, and to get your ideas across. So it wasn't like I was going in there completely unknown. As a matter of fact, I often think about those first few years as very, very lucky. My first job out of college was not, and I say this with no disrespect to people who are starting out today. It was not like an internship job. I was not Xeroxing and getting coffee and just doing, trying to watch other people do the job. I was thrown into it, and I felt very, very lucky to have the opportunity to be an economist, really, to do that stuff right out of the gate. And believe me, the first 6 months, you're really trying to figure out where the bathroom is mostly, and realizing that all the stuff you learned in school, all 12 of those economics courses didn't even have anything to do with what I was working on. So, yeah. When I got to television, the stakes were a little bit different, and the personalities were different. It was very ego driven. Before, I was usually working with very, very, very smart people, especially at the top. Not that the people at the top weren't very smart, but they had something else, and sometimes something instead, which was this ability to be adept with finding talent, to find programming, to recognize programming, to understand audiences. I mean, those are, you talk about soft skills. I mean, those are people who didn't even necessarily go to, certainly didn't go to business school, but, didn't really need to have a whole lot of business when they walked into it, business background. And we're in business, we're responsible for the bottom line, or ultimately, but we're really kind of programmers sometimes. And that made for interesting times in the entertainment industry. I've often said that the entertainment industry could use a dose of management training because it was not very well managed. I will say that. And I really staked myself to being a good manager, being a good organizational person, meaning, what should an organization look like, who should do what, and how should things be organized for success. And after comedy, when I went to other channels, I was president of Court TV for a while. I really tried to be a good business manager as well as a good programmer. And that's an odd combination. People noted that about me. They said, man, one of the programmers who worked for me at Court TV said, I never had a boss who understood what I actually did, but you do. And that's because I had been a programmer as well by that time.
Right, because there's the taste of what the audience would appreciate versus the mechanics of what needs to happen to keep the lights on to produce content. Those are two kind of very separate skill sets.
True, but I think both are very important to the success of almost any corporation. I mean, with all due respect to your mentor, which is where you started, yeah, profits are very, very important, but you got to have heart. I actually did some work for Panasonic in the late, I guess around 2015 to 2018. And I was fascinated with the organization. But, listen, these are people who, some of them loved the electronics industry. I mean, just thought it was great. That wasn't me at the time. I was a consultant. But I think that the people who really make these things work are the people who love or have some heart for what they were doing. And I found so many people at Panasonic on the technology side, especially who were tinkerers as kids and just, were fascinated by the whole thing and wanted to be involved. And even the people who weren't on the technology side had some deep regard for the technology and wanted to be part of it. So very important to be a little of both.
Right. I think that hints at the answer to a question that I reached out to some of the community and said, all right, if you were going to ask Art a question, what would you ask him? And one of the folks said, how do you separate crazy eccentric from real genius when it comes to pitching new shows and doing that kind of a thing? So is it having your ear to the ground for that heart and enthusiasm for that world, or was it more, it's like, you're so crazy it just might work? How did you get that vibe for who needs to be where doing what?
Well, I think it's true that a lot of the more creative people, especially on the comedy side, were a little bit crazy and outrageous, and we all know examples of that because we've seen it either on television or read about it in People magazine. But when you're pitched and somebody wants to do a show, there's a certain level of seriousness that comes even with the crazy. There's a certain level of, again, I would call it heart for the project. I mean, an example is Bill Maher, Politically Incorrect, which he pitched us in 1992, I guess. And he came to us and he pitched me in a diner. I was in a diner. It's in the book in LA. And he said, I want to do a show where, like all comedians, I walk up to the line and I cross the line. I want to do things that get me in trouble. Now, that sounds a little bit crazy. I mean, on the face of it, you might want to say, somebody might say, well, no, I don't think as a television network with advertisers, we really want to get into trouble. And Bill Maher went on to do the same show effectively at the ABC after comedy. They lured him away. And then at HBO. But at ABC, he got in big trouble, as you may recall, for making a joke about something that happened at 9/11. But that was the show, and that is the risk you're taking with something like that. Now, I also had pitches from guys where the pitch was just so completely crazy that you said, okay, thanks. I think you're really funny, but this will never work on television. I don't think. Or I'd say it's crazy enough to try. Let me give you an example of that. Somebody came in and said, you know what we ought to do? We ought to cover the State of the Union address live and make jokes about it while the president's talking. Now, that is a crazy idea. That is just like, okay, how many ways can I say that's crazy? And the guy pitching it was kind of crazy. And I said, that's just crazy enough to work. And we did it. And we got Al Franken to be the guy making comments on George Bush's speech, the first George Bush. And it was tremendously successful. It was tremendously audacious, but very funny. And listen, in the comedy business, you want to find new ways to really explore comedy. And I think everybody's seen that, especially with the advent of Netflix and streaming and TikTok. There's lots of ways you can do comedy, and Comedy Central and Comedy Channel, we wanted to be a place for that kind of comedy, a home for comedy that would have otherwise not had a home.
Right. That wasn't too sterile. That wasn't too safe.
Right.
Right. And one of the most common questions that I got from folks was, what was your favorite show?
Well, I have to say, I mean, they're all my children, the ones I worked on. I mean, I wasn't there for all of them. But Mystery Science Theater 3000, which I hope people still know about today. It's still around in many forms. But that came in the mail before we launched Comedy Channel. And it came with a note and a tape that was a demo tape. And it said, we heard you guys are launching a Comedy Channel. Is this something that would interest you? And it was the most brilliant kind of offbeat comedy that I'd ever seen. Sure, you could think of it. As a matter of fact, Eddie Gordetsky, going back to him, he said, we ought to do a show that's comedians watching television or comedians watching movies. But here it was, fully realized, with robots and a story and Joel Hodgson and brilliant writing. Where did that come from, right? And where was it going to go if it wasn't for Comedy Channel or Comedy Central? Where? CBS? I don't think so. So, yeah, I think that was my favorite show. And I got to know the writers. We went out, we worked with them and everything. And it was just my first real kind of immersive experience in watching comedy writers do what they do. And it was so much fun. Yeah, I got a lot of heart for that show.
That's great. That's great. How did that mail work? Right? It's not like it was on the internet and you could just look up your email or tweet at you, and then Twitter gives you a notification, hey, somebody's trying to get your attention. They just write it to HBO and the guy starting that thing, and then it works its way through.
It was pretty much like that. It was pretty much like that. And listen, when you're starting something and you don't know what it's going to look like when it's fully baked, you're really open to lots of stuff. You're opening all your mail. And in those days, that's how you got your mail. You had to open it. But you got to remember, there was no comedy network around that we could say, well, we're going to do it like that comedy network, but here's how we're going to be different and better. This was really a from scratch thing. And I certainly was throwing a wide net to the extent that I could. And, really hoping for breakthrough comedy that wouldn't show up elsewhere.
Because 24 hours, 7 days a week, that's a long time every day that has to have something going on.
Yeah, well, that's the main title, is Constant Comedy. And the challenge there was not really clear to anyone, certainly not me, until we launched. And then it's like, okay, we just ran the schedule and we got to do this whole thing all over again tomorrow. And we don't have a whole lot more to offer. We were running the same thing over and over for like a long time before we started, really pulling in volume. But that became part of the challenge. Where's the volume going to come from?
Right.
But it did come.
Did you get a lot of pushback from kind of hard-boiled professionals about not wanting to cannibalize their material? It's kind of back in vaudeville days. You could do the same 12 minutes for 30 years, travel the world, change nothing about it, and have a wonderful career. You air that 12 minutes once, now it's been seen, what's next? Now you've got to farm a whole nother lifetime's worth of effort into 6 months for the next special. So is it kind of difficult to find people that would burn through material like that?
Well, comedy is not quite music. Music is very repeatable. So if you have one great song, even though it's 4 minutes, you can make a living out of that for your whole life. And you want it repeated a lot, assuming people are buying records or CDs or whatever they're buying. Even that's kind of gone to hell, right?
Right.
But comedy is, while not unrepeatable, and we were surprised at the extent to which it was repeatable, especially stand-up comedy acts, it's not infinitely repeatable. What we found with stand-up when we started putting more and more stand-up on the channel, because it was working great, was that there were tons of taped stand-up of comedians starting their career. You got to remember, in the late 80s, early 90s, there was something of a stand-up comedy boom, to the point where every Holiday Inn in every town over 3,000 people had, a little riser and an open mic night, and people were doing comedy. I mean, it was really that pervasive. There was an explosion of comedy clubs in the cities, not just New York, but New York, Chicago, LA, San Diego, and right around the country. Every big city, top 25, 50 big cities, had a comedy scene. Boston certainly had a big comedy scene, Philadelphia. So these guys would get up there trying out their material or doing their 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 15 if they were headliners. And there'd be a video camera on them because the club would tape it. And sometimes there'd be 3 cameras on them. If somebody said, hey, we can make a show out of this, maybe somebody will buy it. And then it was a 3-camera shoot and edited with sound. Interestingly, the comedians were typically getting up there, signing away all the rights. Okay. Sometimes they weren't even getting paid, but in cases where they were getting paid, and there was any kind of a contract, it said, we own this material in, all forms forever, and we can do whatever we want with it. That was a great thing for Comedy Channel when we started, because we were buying this stuff by the ton, literally by the ton, just back the truck up and dump it. And so we end up with early iterations, or sometimes pretty recent iterations, of comedians' acts on the channel that we were repeating a lot because we didn't have a lot of audience or a lot of material. So, we always used to say, hey, if you haven't seen it before, it's new to you, even though we repeated it 50 times. And we were growing then. So we would hear from the comedians, but they were not clear what they wanted to say. It was somewhere between, what the hell, you're running my material over and over. I can't believe you're doing that. And we say, okay, we'll stop. And they say, whoa, wait a second. I'm starting to get recognized on the street because of that one clip you're running of my material. So don't stop. I said, well, okay, so you want us to cut down on it? Well, no, don't exactly cut down on it. It was just totally confusing for them. And they felt like they were being abused a little bit. On the other hand, it was making them famous and getting them jobs. So there you have it. That's what it was about. It was funny.
And that kind of ties into what I wondered about salary negotiations. First, it's high stakes, high risk, medium reward, large reward. You're the kind of spearhead to create this entire environment that becomes the kingmaker, right? That people start getting recognized because they're on this channel so much. So you're the architect behind the scenes, making these stars famous. They get sponsorships and opportunities. You're behind the scenes, not even behind the camera, right? So was your goal to make all this stuff happen and then be known by famous people? Or like, what was the value you were getting out of making all this stuff happen?
I wanted there to be a comedy channel in the world. I loved comedy. I wanted there to be a comedy network in the world. As I said, when I was pitching it, I wasn't sure I was going to get a job on the thing. I wanted to have a job on it, but I wanted to be around it. I mean, for me, the reward was, wow, look where I am. I mean, this is great. Just, and let me be clear. I wasn't making the top level programming decisions from the get go. As I said, Stu was there and Eddie, and, I was part of the mix, but I was the new guy. As time went on, and you talk about making careers, yes, but the curve was kind of like this in terms of Comedy Central's ability to make careers. In the earlier days, Johnny Carson was still on the air. The Johnny Carson show was the career maker for comedians. And in terms of, television writing or television shows, the networks were still a big part of it. The three networks, Fox had shown up, but that's where you wanted to put your television show, or HBO. Yes, show HBO and Showtime. But it wasn't like there were zillions of outlets and lots of demand for a lot of the stuff. So you really, and a lot of these channels had relationships with producers they kept going back to. So it was kind of hard to get in there. It wasn't until later on that I think Comedy Central, probably after I left even, Comedy Central was considered the go-to place to make careers for comedians or comedy television of any kind. But you're right. It even as we started, someone pointed out to me early on that the comedy industry was immediately flattered by the idea that we were throwing them a comedy channel. And that was interesting. That was interesting. I mean, MTV was around, and, you remember Mick Jagger was doing stuff for MTV when it was like this big. And that was the same, it was the same kind of phenomenon. The music industry, or the rock and roll industry at that point, was flattered that somebody was making a television channel about what they did. And that was very helpful. So we had a lot of goodwill in the comedy industry, to the extent that they even considered themselves an industry at that point. And that made me feel good too. That was very rewarding for me.
That's great. And seeing as how we're kind of on the back legs of the time that we've got.
Oh, sad.
How did you know when it was time to transition out? When you kind of go, was that your choice? Was that choice made for you? When did you know?
That's the best straight line I've ever been handed, I think. When did you know it was time to transition out of your job? I think the moment was when my boss said, "You're fired." I think that was pretty much,
so it was
when it
subtle.
all came home to me that it was time to get a new job.
You were invited to pursue opportunities elsewhere.
I was fired. What happened is, I was head of programming and marketing and working at a very high level in the channel, and things were going great, sort of, except that the boss, who was the president, was not well liked by the board, and we all knew this. And he got fired. And when your boss gets fired, you got a problem. I mean, I don't know what it doesn't matter what industry, corporation you're in, and there were plenty of people, board members, putting their arms around my shoulders. Don't worry, Art, man, you're gonna love the new guy. I loved him, except that he didn't love me. And he came in and pretty much, kind of wiped out the pre-existing organization and said, "I got my people, and no, I don't necessarily want to give you a chance. So bye." It didn't happen that quickly, but that's what happened.
Right. So then you landed at the court channel. Was that a a thing that you helped create, or was that already running at the time that you
No,
landed
that's a
there?
great story. It was already running. It was started by a guy named Steve Brill, who was a magazine guy. He was a print guy. He was a lawyer, and he loved the judicial system. He loved courtroom, and there were lots of trials going on then. And his idea was, okay, we're going to put cameras in the courtroom, and we're going to have, news, journalistic commentary on the courtroom trials. And of course, everybody knows that what that looks like, because they got a big dose of OJ. And maybe some other trials along the way. The Menendez brothers was a famous one. But at the end of the day, he didn't make a success of it because he had no primetime programming. All the programming was during the day. And then also he's relying on live trials. Sometimes there weren't great trials. That wasn't a constant thing. And so as a business, it was going down the tubes. He wasn't getting distribution. He wasn't getting revenue from advertisers. Advertisers were a little afraid of the product. And the people who owned it was NBC, Cablevision, and I guess Liberty Media at the time. They decided to give it one more chance. And they got rid of the guy who created it and brought in a guy named Henry Schleiff, who had been at HBO, although I didn't know him. He was very high level and worked at Viacom. And he called me up and he said, I hear you know a lot about cable television and how to put together a television channel. I don't know anything. So why don't you come talk to me? 20 minutes into the interview, he said, okay, you're hired. And I said, well, what's my job? And he said, your job is to make this place a success. I will do everything else. And that was pretty much the way it worked. So I was, it was a fascinating 8 years. I loved it. I had the capability. I think one of the good things about me is to become fascinated with whatever I'm doing. And I loved it. I learned to love the judicial system. And also it was all about mysteries. That's what we started putting on primetime. Forensic analysis, what they now call, true crime TV, which is also very popular. But in those days, we were doing forensic files and, all kinds of shows about investigations, essentially. And it became a top 10 or 15 rated channel very quickly. And the partners were very happy that they had hung in there with us. And we were there for 8 years. And then it got bought by Turner for, I don't know, a couple $1 billion, of which I wasn't an investor or anything. So I just got hey, thanks for everything. So
pat on the back. Thank you for your job.
Right.
Yeah.
We really appreciate it. No, I mean, listen, I was fairly compensated and I had a great time doing it. Henry and I just had so much fun doing that channel together. It was different from comedy. I didn't walk in there as a new kid. I walked in there as something of a seasoned programming executive with lots of experience in lots of areas in cable television and television generally. And that made a huge difference.
That's great. And with your time at Comedy Central and getting to build all those relationships, especially with newcomers and that kind of a thing, a lot of those relationships have kind of stuck with you over the years. It's kind of a two-pronged question, one leading into the other, which is when did the internet make it big for you? Right, when you kind of go, all right, this internet thing seems like it could be something. When was that?
That's a really funny story. And it's in the book. And you didn't read the book yet.
I didn't read the book.
We're just going to be straight with your listeners, but it's so interesting that you're kind of asking all the leading questions as if you had read my book. When the new guy came in, he said, okay, you're in charge of new business development. And of course, there was no new business development. And I said, okay, what's that? And he said, I don't know, I'll figure it out. So I realized that there was this thing called the web at that point. This is the mid 90s. And it was called the World Wide Wait in those days because, you press the button and there was absolutely no response for like 3 minutes and then something would show up. But I thought, okay, well, maybe, as a channel, we should be on the World Wide Web. And everybody thought that was a good idea. My boss, to the extent he was paying attention. And he said, yeah, work on the website. And there was no website then, just our name and like our schedule. And I said, if we're going to make this work, we should do some funny stuff on the web. We should do comedy on the Comedy Central website. And so I was there with some other people who had been displaced, and we were looking for things to do. And that's what we did. We put together a very funny online comedy thing that we, again, had so much fun with. We actually wrote a book at that time based on our experience, thinking that the web was the funniest place in the world, because they had all these stupid websites that, everybody was making a website and they were really dopey. So we wrote a book called Websites We'd Like to See. And it was just, every page was a different stupid website that wasn't really in existence, but, we thought it would be funny. And it sold a lot of copies. It got published under the Comedy Central name. And we sold like 30 or 40,000 copies. And I was very proud of that book. That was just before I got fired. But what do you have to do to keep a job, right? And yeah, the first thing I did when I left Comedy Central, actually, interestingly, was teamed up with some writers and a radio guy. And we were going to syndicate web content, comedy web content, to morning shows, right? How's that for an elevator pitch? All these morning shows are out there. Hey, how you doing? Right? And they were just starting their websites and they didn't know what to put on it, right? And so we give them funny bits, funny web bits, and syndicate it. We started doing that and it did pretty well, and it got bought for not much money. And that was the end of that. And then of course, everybody figured out they should do their own website. That was really the end of that. But that was my experience with the web in those days.
That's great, because you're still doing it, right? You've published the book, and the audiobook version is either, depending on when you're listening to this, just about to come out at the end of September, or been out if you're finding this later. It's a way to engage with your audience in an asynchronous way that they can carry around in their pocket. You're doing your own podcast, and right. A lot of the folks that you've got on that podcast are kind of the behind the scenes experts and folks that are used to working in television with big personalities. I love those conversations. To me, that's always been the most fascinating part about the entertainment world. Sure, talk to me about your standing ovation. Yeah, that's great. Oh, you performed in Vegas. Neat. I want to know the behind the scenes stories about the train wrecks, the manager having to deal with this crazy story. So you're having a lot of really interesting conversations with interesting people that have had a lot of experience.
Listen, if you like that kind of thing, you're going to like my book, because it really is a behind the scenes look at the craziness that is television, especially television in a comedy world in those days. But I think it's probably still pretty much the same. As for the podcast, it's also called Constant Comedy. It's called the Constant Comedy Podcast with Art Bell and Vinny Favale. Vinny is actually the guy I was talking about who came up with the idea for doing the State of the Union address. And he was working with me on the web stuff. And he left when he left, he went to CBS Late Night and worked with David Letterman for 15 years and every comedian who was on that show. And just the funniest guy and just the most creative guy. And he came to me, actually. He said, look, love your book. Great to be in touch with you again. And let's work together. Let's do a podcast, because it's the 30th anniversary. This was in April, 30th anniversary of Comedy Central. And they're not even making a big deal about it. So we did our first season, and we were committed to talking mostly to people who were there at the beginning of Comedy Channel or Comedy Central. We talked to Gail Berman, for example, whose first job, that's not a household name. Her first job in television was at the Comedy Channel. She had been a producer of plays. She went on to become the president of Paramount Pictures. Okay, just to give you an idea of how successful some of these people became. We also interviewed Kevin Murphy. He was the first writer I met on Mystery Science Theater 3000. One of the greatest guys, funniest guys, warm. We had a great conversation with him. And we talked about the first time we met and what it was like when they heard they were going to be on the Comedy Channel. And I was more excited than them because they were going to be on the Comedy Channel. And there was a lot of that. There was a lot of, we were just kids trying to figure out what we're doing. And it was really an explosively creative time for so many people. Scott Carter, who was Bill Maher's producer for 20 years, 30, whatever it is. He just stopped. Man, he had stories to tell, as you can imagine. Brilliant producer of talk television, brilliant producer of that kind of show, and a brilliant guy and a great guy. So yeah, these are the kinds of people we were talking to. Judy Gold, who was on very early on the channel, basically did her act for us on the podcast. So yeah, that was our first season. We're going into our second season. We're broadening a little bit because there's a lot of people involved in comedy. We're gonna we haven't announced this, but we're gonna probably kick it off with Bill Persky, also not a household name. He's an older gentleman who is so funny and so great, who was a consultant to Comedy Central in the early days, who also wrote some of the greatest episodes of the Dick Van Dyke Show, produced That Girl. This guy is a foundational comedy television guy and just a wonderful guy to talk to. So we're going to start with him. Spread out a little bit to some newer comedians, newer people writing books about comedy. Just, we're having fun. Comedy nerds. We're comedy nerds, as Vinny says. And we love comedy.
That's great. And wax poetic a bit about the nature and role of television as kind of a lightning rod for culture, shared experience around the water cooler. Hey, did you see that show last night? Right. It is such a big part of everyday life. So what are some of your broader philosophizings about being in this industry for so long?
Well, first of all, I am so blown away by the terrific talent, the number of shows, the brilliant series that, and not to mention movies, miniseries, everything else. This is a golden age of television. There is just so much opportunity for writers and for performers to find a place on the dial that previously, was a lot different when there were just 3 or 4 networks. So that's great. And I will mention, though, that something was lost when we went from 3 or 4 networks to a million networks, and then ultimately streaming television and TikTok and the fragmented audience that we see today. When I tell you that, I don't even remember exactly what the numbers were, but MASH, which was a big hit in the 70s, was a series, kind of a tragic comedy about Korea. I think the last show was watched by something like 70 million households. Now, you think about the fact that everybody, you could go to work the next day and everybody saw it. Everybody and if somebody didn't see it, they were like, "Oh my God, I can't believe I missed that." But my baby was getting a tooth and I couldn't, it was just, that was what was going on in America at the time. I Love Lucy, which had, ran for forever on Sunday nights or whatever. It wasn't Sunday. I can't remember which night, but that was appointment television for most of America for a long, long time. The Jackie Gleason Show, the Red Skelton Show, Ed Sullivan, all of these shows, either you were watching them or you were watching the loser show on the other network. There wasn't much else to watch. So I kind of miss that. I do. I miss that gestalt. And of course I was a kid or, a teenager or whatever when that was the case. And I really rode the cable television wave, and it's kind of breaking on the beach now because streaming is really taking center stage, as it should. And the cable television networks, even, comedy, they're branching out and they're just basically going to stream their stuff and hopefully the brand will survive. Discovery, that brand will survive. The Learning Channel will survive. These are channels, National Geographic, that brought their audience really a singular experience in television viewing. And I think that's going to continue. But of course, you'll be able to see National Geographic or Comedy Central shows all over the place. So it's interesting.
That's great.
Was that poetic enough? Nothing rhymes, I know, but
Very definitely philosophic. So you checked one of the boxes. So for the folks that are interested in hearing behind the scenes and getting connected with your work, what's the best place for people to check you out?
well, I think you should go to my website, artbellwriter.com, where, there's information about my book, and my audiobook will be announced there, and you can buy it. It's got links to Amazon. Also, it's got an interview with me, which is very funny. People tell me I interviewed myself, and some of the writing I've done, short pieces that I've done that weren't in the book, either about me or about something else. I'm currently working on fiction, so eventually that'll show up somewhere, and you could learn about that there. Um, I hope people can check in on my podcast, and you can find that wherever podcasts are sold or found, for that matter. And yes, it's a free podcast. So yeah, go to iTunes and find the Constant Comedy podcast. You'll fall in love with Vinny Favale. He's so funny, and he's so smart. And the people we have had on are really brilliant. And the second season is coming up. I read my own audiobook, and I think that's going to be an interesting experience. If you like listening to me today, of course, if you thought I couldn't listen to this guy for 10 hours talking about himself, but and you don't have to do it 10 hours in a row. But if you're at all interested in audiobooks, I think it's really coming out very nicely. So that'll be out. And I think that's pretty much it for me for promoting myself.
Perfect. We'll call that a stuck landing if we've ever heard one. And I'll do all the official show notes and link out to everything as well.
Okay, great.
And include that in all the email and anything. Is there anything that you had hoped to work in or talk about that I didn't touch on?
Just one thing: read the book. And I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to your audience. I've gotten such nice feedback from so many people about, I read it, then I gave it to my kids and said, you got to read this, because it's about sticking to it. It's about, it's about seeing a dream come true. It's about adversity in business and the world. And I talk a lot to film students and television students and business students. And I love doing that. I love talking to young people. So I think I really recommend my own book. I know that's a little crazy to say it that way, but there you have it.
That's great. That's great. I mean, that's kind of why I wrote my book wherever it is, because I wound up having the same conversations after shows. And then a couple of years later, these college kids were saying, hey, thanks so much for talking to me. It made all the difference in the world. Here's what I'm doing now. And it's because you took 10 minutes to talk. I don't even know if you remember me, but I had to say it. And I was like, oh, okay, this stuff, I guess people like it. Cram it all in a book. Here you go. You don't even need to talk to me. Just read it. So yeah, right. I'll definitely include that for sure. So yeah, I'll make sure that this goes out on Monday morning, and I'll cut it up over the weekend and produce the whole thing.
Great. Did you get what you wanted?
Absolutely. Time talking to you. So there you go. That was it.
Okay, good. I hope that was good. All right, I'll keep my eyes peeled for it, and let me know what you think of the book. I mean, if you are going to read it, and I hope you are.
Absolutely.
I'd like to hear from you.
Deal. Don't you threaten me with a good time. Awesome. All right. Genuinely, thank you so much for hopping on and chatting with me. I really appreciate getting to ask you those questions.
Okay, great. I enjoyed it. Thanks, Jonathan.
Yep. All right, man. Later.